William McKinley was shot dead in September 1901 after 4.5 years as President of the United States. During that time, he had led the nation to victory in the war against Spain and out of economic recession. Before becoming the 25th President, he had fought in the Civil War, was elected to Congress for 14 years, and spent 2 terms as Governor of Ohio. However, he was probably best known as the main author of the McKinley Tariff of 1890, which helped promote economic prosperity in America towards the end of the 19th century. Now, just to take a brief look at his life and career before he became president. William McKinley was born in Niles in the state of Ohio in January 1843. He was working as a teacher in the local school when the Civil War began. He joined the Union Army as a private and was promoted to brevet major of volunteers by the end of the conflict. In relation to his private life, he married Ida Saxton, the daughter of a local banker, in 1871. They had 2 daughters, but unfortunately both died in infancy. After the Civil War, McKinley studied law and was called to the Ohio Bar in 1867, just 2 years after the conflict ended. A decade later, by the mid-1870s, McKinley had become a highly successful lawyer. He defended coal mining strikers who clashed with police in 1876 and impressed Mark Hanna, a coal mine owner actually, by his outstanding courtroom skills. The courtroom battle on behalf of the coal miners generated a lot of good publicity, and Mark Hanna later became a strong McKinley supporter and political organiser. In 1877, McKinley won a seat in the Ohio House of Representatives. 8 years later, at the age of 42, he won a seat in the United States Congress. He was a highly intelligent guy and quickly became an expert in financial matters. Throughout the 1880s, he rejected the expansionary policy based on silver promoted by many congressmen, especially in the South and in the West, in the western states. McKinley believed basically in the coal standard combined with the high tariff was the best means to promote economic prosperity in the United States. As chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, he was the chief author of the McKinley Tariff in 1890. However, he lost his seat in Congress and spent 2 terms as a governor of Ohio between 1892 and 96. In 1896, he won the Republican nomination for president, mainly based on his record for high tariffs and also his defence of the gold standard. William McKinley defeated William Jennings Bryan in the November 1896 election. In his inaugural address which followed, he outlined his belief that the tariff needed to be reformed and possibly raised further in order to protect US industry and jobs. He also emphasised his belief in the gold standard as the best means to achieve economic prosperity. In relation to his cabinet, John Sherlock became the Secretary of State and Lyman J. Cage became Secretary of Treasury, the 2 most important positions. Russell Alger became Secretary of War but was replaced when the war with Spain began. John Davis Long became Secretary of the Navy. In relation to Congress, Nelson Dingley, a representative of Maine, became chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. This was a very important position. He became, a year later, the main author of the Dingley Tariff of 1897. This revised the tariff system of taxes on imports, and in some cases they went up to 50%, and it sent the US economy back on the road to recovery. It's a very important change in the tariff. The tariff lasted for about 12 years and was changed again in the Taft presidency in 1909. You may wish to subscribe if you'd like to see more detail on that. Another notable appointment by McKinley was that of Theodore Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He knew Roosevelt was an aggressive type, but he basically responded to pressure from New York Republicans who wanted to get rid of him as police commissioner. In his inaugural address also, McKinley referred to the need for sound money and the gold standard in order to conduct international commerce. In fact, he had built his entire career on 2 ideas, one the high tariff and the second one the gold standard, so that in 1900 he signed the Gold Standard Act into being and spoke of it as the best means for continued stability and prosperity. In relation to foreign affairs, over the previous decade, Spanish authorities had used brutal measures, brutal force to put down rebels in the island of Cuba. Americans were basically sympathetic to the islanders and seen it as a parallel between themselves, their own independence, demand for independence a century earlier. In McKinley's first year in office, US authorities negotiated with Spain in regard to Cuban independence. However, these negotiations broke down and McKinley sent the battleship USS Maine to the Cuban coast, basically in response to calls from Congress for action. In February 1898, the ship was blown up and this caused Congress to declare war on Spain. Commodore George Dewey attacked the Spanish fleet in Malana Bay, the Philippines, and quickly achieved a decisive victory. Spain was completely overpowered by the US and had no way of resupplying their army and navy and were forced to surrender. They gave up control in the negotiations that followed. They gave up control of the Philippines and the island of Guam, with the US Army in control of Cuba. However, the Teller Amendment in Congress meant that the US was committed to Cuban independence and sovereignty. In the aftermath of defeat, Spain signed the Treaty of Paris in December 1898. Basically, they lost their major overseas territories to the US, and the United States agreed to pay $20 million in return. The situation in Cuba remained somewhat unstable in the aftermath of the Spanish defeat, and both the US Army and the local citizens were plagued with the yellow fever. Thousands lost their lives. Despite the US commitment to Cuban independence, the American Army remained for several years, and the Platt Amendment of 1901 set out 7 conditions under which the US Army would agree to leave. It laid down such things as that Cuba could not go into debt to another nation or agree a treaty with another nation contrary to the interests of the US. It defined the US-Cuban relationship for decades to come to be one of US dominance over Cuba. In relation to Hawaii, Hawaii actually continued to be a troubled area as well. Sanford B. Dole had overthrown the Queen 5 or 6 years earlier in 1893. McKinley basically convinced Congress to support the annexation of Hawaii in order to avoid a royal counter-revolution, or indeed for that matter an invasion of the islands by Japan. This was also suspected something that could happen. Thereafter, Hawaii became an important naval base for the American Navy. Hawaii officially became a US territory in 1898 on the basis of a joint resolution of both houses of Congress promoted by Francis Newlands of Nevada. Elsewhere in the world, for example in China, in relation to China, McKinley pursued a policy known as the open door policy. This is a kind of a gentleman's agreement whereby all nations agreed to have peaceful trading relationships with that country, with China, without actually splitting up its territory or without involving themselves in territorial conquest of any kind. However, in relation to the Boxer Revolution, McKinley sent 5,000 troops, US troops, to protect US citizens in China, in Peking, and other Westerners who were trapped there also. In regard to Britain, the US had a changing relationship. In regard to the Pamela Canal, for instance, the US negotiated a new deal with Britain. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850 had established an equal relationship of both nations in regard to the canal. However, America's increased strength meant that the former treaty was somewhat out of date, and a new treaty by Secretary of State John Hay meant that the US would have sole rights to the canal and sole rights to fortify and defend the canal, but also agreed with Britain to make the canal available to all other nations. In relation to civil rights, McKinley as president was somewhat a disappointment to people of colour. Although he appointed some black people to senior government positions, he failed to condemn violent attacks on them in Georgia and South Carolina. Also, he refused to send US Marshals following the overthrow of the elected government of North Carolina and the Wilmington riots of 1898. In various speeches while touring the South, he focused on healing the wounds of the Civil War rather than on civil rights for people of colour. So he was a talker rather than a man of action in regard to civil rights. McKinley picked Theodore Roosevelt as his running mate in the 1900 election. Roosevelt had emerged from the war as something of a war hero in his leadership of the Rough Riders up San June Hill in Cuba in the Spanish War. They easily defeated William Jennings Bryan on the basis of victory in war, sound money, basically the gold standard, and also a prosperous economy. McKinley won actually 28 states to Bryan's 17. At this stage there were 45 states in the Union, and the population of America was about 76 million, almost equal to the combined total of Britain and France, its old European rivals. In his second inaugural address, McKinley laid out big plans for the future. However, unfortunately, his days were numbered. On the 6th of September 1901, a few months later, Leon Chonkas shot the president in the back at the Pan American exhibition in Buffalo. He died eight days later.